The night I met Mary, she was wearing a red dress. Not crimson, not cherry, just red. I remember it because she spilled her drink on it while laughing at some joke I barely heard over the music. That's how it started, a laugh, a mess, and two people trying to wipe the stain off her dress with cheap cocktail napkins. 15 years later, it wasn't a laugh or a mess that got my attention. It was silence. This particular night, we were hosting one of those neighborhood dinner parties we had become known for. Our backyard was strung with fairy lights, tables were loaded with dishes Mary had spent the afternoon preparing, and our guests were already deep into their second bottles of wine. I was in the corner manning the grill, flipping burgers, and dodging questions about how the Buckeyes were shaping up this season. Mary was across the yard, standing too close to someone she shouldn't have been. The man was our new neighbor, Mark. A smug guy who had moved in 3 months ago with his 2 rescue dogs and a knack for making people feel like they owed him something. I hadn't thought much of him until tonight. They weren't touching. They weren't whispering. But something was there. It was in the way she leaned into his words, her head tilted just slightly, the way she didn't flinch when his hand brushed hers. I watched her laugh, really laugh, the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from her in months. And then, as I flipped a burger onto a plate, Mark turned to me. He caught my eye, smiled, and raised his beer in a casual toast, like we were part of some inside joke. Except I wasn't laughing. The night ended like all the others, our guests filtered out with hugs and thank yous, and Mary disappeared into the kitchen to clean up. I followed her, watching as she scrubbed plates and hummed a tune under her breath. "You seem to enjoy yourself tonight," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. She glanced up, her hands still covered in soap suds. "Of course. It was a nice evening." "Mark seemed to think so too," I added, testing the waters. Her hands froze for just a moment, the slightest hesitation before she resumed scrubbing. "He's friendly," she said, too quickly, not looking up. Friendly. That word hit me like a punch to the gut. But I let it go for the moment. What I didn't know was that this seemingly small moment wasn't the start of anything. It was the middle of something that had been brewing for far too long. And I was about to find out just how deep it went. The days following that backyard party were some of the longest I'd ever endured. Not because anything obvious was happening, but because I couldn't stop replaying everything I'd seen and heard. Mary, standing so close to Mark, laughing like he was the most fascinating man she'd ever met. That brief hesitation when I mentioned his name. And then there was that damned toast, the way Mark looked at me like he knew something I didn't. I wasn't the kind of man who jumped to conclusions, but I wasn't blind either. The signs were there if I was willing to look for them, and I couldn't ignore the itch in my brain telling me something wasn't right. So, I started paying attention, not obsessively, not yet, but just enough to see if my gut was onto something. Mary and I shared a small home office off the living room, a space we both used for our respective work. It was where she often sat with her planner, detailing schedules for the events she coordinated. I began noticing little things, the way she'd close her laptop when I walked in, the faint scent of cologne on her clothes after she came home from client lunches, the way she'd stay up late on her computer, saying she was catching up on emails. It wasn't anything concrete, but it added up. The turning point came the following Saturday. Mary told me she had to leave for a work event, a late afternoon setup for a wedding reception downtown. That wasn't unusual, as her job often had her working weekends. What was unusual was the way she avoided eye contact as she explained it. She was already dressed, her makeup carefully applied, her hair styled into a sleek bun. She looked great, like she always did before a big event, but there was an edge to her demeanor and almost imperceptible nervousness. "Will you be back late?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Probably," she said, grabbing her bag and heading for the door. "Don't wait up." That was it. No kiss, no smile, no usual half-joking reminder to make sure the kids didn't eat pizza for dinner again. Just a quick exit and the sound of the front door shutting behind her. I waited a full 5 minutes before grabbing my car keys. Now, I'm not a private investigator. I don't know the first thing about tailing someone, and the thought of doing it to my wife made me sick. But I couldn't sit there in that empty house, stewing in my suspicions. So, I got in my truck and followed the route I knew she'd take to the venue. Her car was easy to spot in traffic, a silver sedan with a bumper sticker from her alma mater. I stayed back, keeping enough distance to avoid drawing attention. The drive didn't take long. She pulled into the parking lot of a boutique hotel downtown, one I recognized as a popular wedding venue. For a moment, I felt relief, maybe this really was just another work event. But then I saw him. Mark. He was standing by the side entrance of the hotel, dressed casually in a button-down shirt and jeans. Mary got out of her car, looked around quickly, and walked straight to him. No hesitation, no pretense. He smiled when he saw her, that same smug smile I remembered from the party. And then, without a second thought, he leaned in and kissed her. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly I thought I might rip it off. I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even breathe as I watched them together. The kiss wasn't long, but it was enough. Enough to confirm everything I'd been trying to deny. They stood close, talking briefly, and then he gestured toward the hotel. Mary followed him inside without looking back. I sat there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. My thoughts raced, colliding in a chaotic mess. How long had this been going on? Was this the first time? Did she even care if I found out? I wanted to storm into that hotel, to confront them both right then and there. But something held me back. Maybe it was shock, or maybe it was the faint, desperate hope that there was some other explanation. Whatever it was, I couldn't bring myself to act. Instead, I drove home, my mind spinning the entire way. I didn't even notice the familiar landmarks or the turns I took to get there. When I walked into the house, it felt like stepping into a stranger's life. Everything looked the same, the pictures on the wall, the kids' backpacks by the door, but nothing felt right anymore. I spent the rest of the evening pacing the living room, trying to figure out what to do. My phone sat on the coffee table, tempting me to call her, to demand answers. But what would I even say? How do you start a conversation that might end your entire life as you know it? Hours later, when Mary finally came home, I was sitting in the dark, staring at nothing. She walked in quietly, kicking off her heels by the door. "Hey," she said, her voice casual, almost tired. "You're still up?" I didn't respond. I just looked at her, trying to see something in her face that would explain it all away. But all I saw was my wife, the woman I thought I knew, standing there like nothing had happened. "Yeah," I said finally. "I couldn't sleep." She nodded, brushing past me on her way to the bedroom. "Well, I'm exhausted. I'm going to bed." I watched her go, my chest tight with anger, sadness, and disbelief. I knew I couldn't let it go, but I also knew I wasn't ready for the confrontation. Not yet. For the first time in our marriage, I didn't follow her to bed. I stayed on the couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how to confront a truth I wished I didn't know. I didn't sleep that night. Not even for a second. I lay on the couch, staring at the faint glow of the street lamp filtering through the curtains, my mind racing with everything I had seen. Every quiet moment between us suddenly had new meaning. Every late-night work excuse, every quick laugh that seemed out of place, it all fell into a pattern I couldn't ignore. But knowing wasn't enough. I needed to hear her say it. I needed her to explain why she'd thrown everything we had away for a man like Mark. The next morning, Mary came downstairs looking as though nothing had happened. She was in her usual routine, hair pulled into a messy bun, wearing her old sweatshirt and pajama pants, phone in hand as she scanned emails. "You're up early," she said, glancing at me as she poured herself a cup of coffee. I watched her carefully, trying to pick apart her every movement, every word. "Didn't sleep much," I said. "Rough night?" she asked casually, not even looking up. I wanted to scream at her. To slam my hand on the table and demand answers. But I kept my voice calm, even as my pulse pounded in my ears. "Something like that." She didn't press. Instead, she wandered off into the living room, settling onto the couch with her coffee and her phone. It was as though nothing had happened, as though she wasn't carrying the weight of a betrayal that was slowly crushing me. I waited until the kids were up and out of the house before making my move. Emma had a soccer game, and Ben was going to a friend's house for the day. By 11 a.m., it was just the two of us in the house. I found Mary in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone again. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low but firm. She glanced up, startled by my tone. "About what?" "About last night," I said, watching her face closely. Her brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion crossing her features. "What about last night?" "I followed you," I said, cutting straight to the point. "I saw you at the hotel with Mark." The color drained from her face instantly. Her hand froze midair, still holding her coffee mug. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just stared at me like a deer caught in headlights. "What are you talking about?" she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't," I snapped. "Don't insult me by pretending you don't know what I'm talking about. I saw you. I saw him. And I saw what the two of you did outside that hotel." Her mouth opened, then closed again, as though she couldn't decide what to say. Finally, she set the mug down on the counter, her hands trembling. "It's not what you think," she said weakly. "Not what I think?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Then explain it to me, Mary. Because from where I was sitting, it looked a hell of a lot like you kissing another man. So go ahead. Tell me what it really was." She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room like she was searching for an escape. "It was a mistake," she said finally. "It didn't mean anything." "A mistake," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "How long have these mistakes been going on, Mary? Weeks? Months?" She didn't answer, which told me everything I needed to know. "You lied to me," I said, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to hold it together. "You looked me in the eyes and lied to me, over and over again. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice shaking. It got out of hand." "Out of hand?" I laughed bitterly. "You make it sound like you accidentally tripped and fell into an affair. Own it, Mary. Be honest for once in your life." She looked at me, tears streaming down her face now. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry?" I shouted. "You're sorry? For what, Mary? For betraying me? For destroying our family? Or are you just sorry you got caught?" She flinched at my words, her tears falling harder now. "I didn't want to hurt you," she sobbed. "Well, congratulations," I said coldly. "You failed." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The room was filled with the sound of her quiet sobs and my heavy breathing. "How long?" I asked finally. She hesitated, then whispered, 6 months. 6 months. Half a year of lies and deceit. My stomach churned at the thought. "Why him?" I asked, my voice cracking. "What does he have that I don't? What did I do to deserve this?" "It wasn't about you," she said, shaking her head. "It wasn't about anything you did or didn't do. I don't even know why it happened. It just did." "That's not good enough," I snapped. "You don't get to shrug this off like it's some random thing that just happened. You made a choice, Mary. You chose him. Over me. Over our kids. Over everything we built together." She sank to the floor, her face buried in her hands. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she repeated, her voice muffled. "I don't care what you meant," I said, my voice cold and hard. "You destroyed everything, Mary. And now, you're going to have to live with the consequences." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her there on the floor, sobbing. For the first time in my life, I didn't care. Her tears didn't move me. Her apologies meant nothing. She had made her choices. And now, it was my turn to make mine. When I walked out of the kitchen, I wasn't just leaving Mary sobbing on the floor, I was leaving behind the life I thought I had. My mind was racing, not just with anger but with a calculated need to take control. If she could throw away everything we'd built, then I wasn't going to go down quietly. This wasn't going to be one of those stories where the cheated husband packs his bags and lets the wife move on with her new life while he's left picking up the pieces. No, if Mary thought she could betray me, humiliate me, and walk away unscathed, she was about to learn otherwise. I went to the garage, where I kept a small cabinet filled with files. For years, I'd organized everything meticulously: our joint accounts, the mortgage paperwork, her retirement savings, and even records of her income from her event planning business. I wasn't going to let her make me a fool, not financially, not emotionally, not in any way. First, I needed information. She'd admitted to 6 months of betrayal, but I didn't trust her to tell me the whole story. She'd already lied for half a year, what's another lie or two now? So I dug. I started with our shared phone plan. A quick login to the account gave me a detailed list of every call and text she'd made in the last 6 months. Sure enough, Mark's number popped up more times than I could count. Daytime, nighttime, even during hours when I was home. I felt a fresh wave of anger with every entry. But that wasn't all. I scrolled further and found texts from unfamiliar numbers. Some were brief, seemingly harmless exchanges. Others? Let's just say they were suggestive enough to confirm that Mark wasn't the only secret she was keeping. It wasn't just him. Mary had been talking to other men, too. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling a combination of disgust and cold determination. This wasn't just an affair, it was a pattern. I printed everything. Pages upon pages of call logs, timestamps, and text excerpts. Every interaction with Mark, every flirtatious exchange with those other numbers, all of it. I wasn't going to confront her with these, I was going to use them to make sure she couldn't manipulate her way out of the consequences. Next, I turned my attention to finances. Mary had her own business accounts, separate from our joint ones. Normally, I didn't care much about what she did with her money, it was hers to handle. But now, I was curious. Using the banking details she'd left logged into her laptop, I accessed her accounts and went through the transactions. There it was: dinners, hotel bookings, and even a weekend spa getaway she'd claimed was a girl's trip. The receipts told a different story. One of the transactions was a charge for a boutique hotel in the same city where Mark had been sent for work the previous month. She wasn't just cheating, she was using our money to do it. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became, but I didn't let the emotion cloud my focus. Every receipt, every bank statement, and every piece of evidence went into a folder. I wasn't planning to hold on to these just for the sake of it, I knew I'd need them if things went the way I expected. That night, I sat at the dining table, reviewing everything I'd gathered. It was late, and the house was silent. Mary had gone to bed hours ago, probably exhausted from crying, but I felt no sympathy. I was too busy planning my next move. The next morning, I didn't mention what I'd found. I acted normal, or as normal as I could manage. Mary tried to approach me several times, her face red and swollen from crying, but I shut her down with short, clipped responses. I don't want to talk, I told her firmly. She nodded and backed off, giving me space. By the afternoon, I'd put my plan into motion. The first step was legal. I made an appointment with a divorce attorney, one of the best in town. I brought the folder of evidence with me, laying it all out on the table for the attorney to review. She glanced over the materials, raising her eyebrows as she flipped through the pages. "This is thorough," she said. "I want to protect myself," I replied. "She's the one who cheated, and I'm not going to let her take advantage of me in the divorce." The attorney nodded, jotting down notes. "With this evidence, we can argue for a favorable settlement. If there are kids involved, this will help establish custody in your favor, too." "Full custody," I said firmly. "She can have visitation, but I'm not letting someone like her set the example for my children." The attorney gave me a measured look. "It's a strong case," she said. "We'll file first thing Monday." But I wasn't done. While the legal side was in motion, I had one more move to make. Mary's family was important to her: her parents, her sisters, her nieces, and nephews. She prided herself on being the glue that held the family together. I'd always respected that about her. But now, I wasn't going to let her hide behind the facade of the perfect wife and mother. I contacted her parents first, arranging a meeting with them at their house. When I arrived, they greeted me warmly, completely unaware of what was coming. "I need to talk to you about Mary," I said, my voice steady but firm. Her mother frowned, sensing the seriousness in my tone. "What's going on?" I laid everything out. The affair, the other men, the hotel receipts, it all came spilling out, as blunt and honest as I could make it. I didn't sugarcoat a thing. By the time I was finished, her mother was in tears, and her father sat silently, his hands clenched into fists. "I didn't come here to turn you against her," I said, though that wasn't entirely true. "But you deserve to know the truth." Her father finally spoke, his voice low and angry. "This isn't the Mary we raised," he said. "No, it's not," I agreed. When I left their house, I knew the fallout would be swift. Her parents wouldn't keep quiet about this, they'd confront her, and the rest of the family would hear about it soon enough. By the time I got home, Mary was waiting for me in the living room. "My parents just called," she said, her voice shaking. "Good," I replied, walking past her without another word. This wasn't over yet, but the wheels were in motion. Mary had started this mess, but I was going to finish it. I didn't expect Michelle to wait long before forcing the issue. She wasn't the type to let things linger, and after her parents called to confront her, I knew it was only a matter of time. By evening, she found me in the den, where I was sorting through some of the kids' old school projects. I'd told myself I was doing it to keep busy, but the truth was I couldn't sit still. My mind was too restless, my emotions still too raw. "John," she said, standing in the doorway. Her voice was tentative, soft, almost unrecognizable. "Can we talk?" I glanced up at her. She looked a mess, hair disheveled, eyes red from crying, face pale. For a brief moment, I felt a twinge of something. Pity? Maybe. But it wasn't strong enough to stop me from nodding. "Go ahead," I said, motioning to the chair across from me. She stepped inside and sat down slowly, like the weight of the moment was pressing her down. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. "I don't know how we got here," she began finally. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she took a deep breath to steady herself. "I never meant for this to happen." "You've said that before," I replied evenly. "And it still doesn't mean anything. You don't accidentally cheat on your husband for 6 months, Michelle." Her head dropped, and she stared at her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't have an excuse," she admitted. "I could tell you it was because I felt neglected, or because I was stressed, or any number of things, but none of that would make it right." "You're damn right it wouldn't," I said, my voice hardening. "You had problems? Fine. You could have talked to me. You could have asked for counseling. Hell, you could have told me you were unhappy and wanted out. But instead, you chose to sneak around behind my back. You made me look like a fool." "I know," she whispered. "No, I don't think you do," I shot back, my anger bubbling to the surface. "Because if you did, you wouldn't have done it. And you definitely wouldn't have kept doing it for months. So tell me, Michelle, why Mark? Why him?" Her head snapped up at the mention of his name, her eyes wide. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "I wish I could give you an answer, but I can't. He was just there. And he made me feel." "Don't," I interrupted sharply. "Don't you dare say he made you feel special or wanted or any of that bullshit. Do you think I don't know what those kinds of men are like? He saw an opportunity, and he took it. And you let him. You let him walk into our lives and ruin everything." Her tears started falling again, but I didn't care. She could cry all night if she wanted, it wouldn't change anything. "I regret it," she said through her sobs. "I regret all of it. If I could take it back, I would. But you can't," I said coldly. "You can't undo the lies, the betrayal, the nights you spent with him when you should have been here with your family. You can't erase any of it." Her shoulders shook, and she buried her face in her hands. "I don't want to lose you, John," she choked out. I laughed bitterly. "You lost me the moment you kissed him, Michelle. Everything we had, everything I thought we were, it's gone. And you're the one who destroyed it. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. Isn't there any way we can fix this? She asked desperately. I'll do anything, counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. Just tell me what I need to do. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on my knees as I stared her down. If you wanted to fix this, you should have thought about that before you decided to sleep with another man. You don't get to come back now, after the damage is done, and ask for forgiveness like it's some kind of magic reset button. But I love you, she said, her voice breaking. Do you? I asked harshly. Because if this is how you show love, I don't want any part of it. Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't waver. I'd made up my mind long before this conversation, and nothing she said or did now was going to change that. I've already spoken to a lawyer, I said, my tone flat. The divorce papers will be ready next week. Her head snapped up again, her eyes wide with shock. You've already decided? She asked, her voice trembling. Of course I have, I said. What did you think was going to happen, Michelle? That I'd just forgive you and we'd go back to the way things were? That's not how this works. She looked like she was about to argue, but then her shoulders slumped, and she nodded slowly. I guess I deserve this, she said quietly. Yes, you do, I replied. For a long time, we sat there in silence, the weight of everything that had happened hanging heavy in the air. Finally, she stood up, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her shirt. I'll pack a bag, she said softly. You don't need to leave tonight, I said, surprising even myself. The kids are already in bed. You can stay until we figure out the logistics. She nodded, looking both relieved and defeated. Thank you, she said. I didn't respond. I just watched as she left the room, her footsteps fading into the distance. When she was gone, I let out a long breath and leaned back in my chair. It wasn't relief, exactly, it was more like the first step toward reclaiming my life. For years, I'd built everything around Michelle, around the idea of us. But now, it was time to focus on myself and the kids. This wasn't the ending I wanted, but it was the one she'd chosen. And I wasn't going to let her choice define the rest of my life. The days following my conversation with Michelle were a mix of chaos and clarity. She stayed in the house for the kids' sake, but the tension between us was unbearable. We barely spoke, moving around each other like strangers in a shared space. Every time I saw her, I felt the anger bubbling up again, but I forced myself to stay calm for Emma and Ben. They deserved better than two parents at each other's throats. Monday morning, I met with my lawyer again to finalize the paperwork. As I sat in the sleek conference room, flipping through the stack of documents in front of me, I felt the weight of it all settle on my shoulders. This was real. 15 years of marriage reduced to legal jargon and dotted lines. Are you sure you want to move forward with full custody? My lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Karen, asked as I reviewed the custody section. I'm sure, I said firmly. Michelle can have visitation, but I'm not leaving my kids in the care of someone who's been sneaking around and lying for months. Karen nodded, scribbling a note. You've built a solid case with the evidence you've provided. The judge will take it seriously. But you need to prepare yourself, it won't be easy. I already knew that. Michelle wouldn't just roll over and accept it, no matter how guilty she felt. She might cry and apologize, but when it came to her relationship with the kids, she'd fight tooth and nail to keep her role intact. The papers were filed that afternoon, and the reality of the situation hit me like a punch to the gut. I was divorcing the woman I'd spent half my life with. It wasn't just a betrayal of love, it was a betrayal of everything we'd built together. And yet, for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of control. That night, Michelle cornered me in the kitchen as I was cleaning up after dinner. The kids were upstairs, likely playing video games or texting their friends. I got a call from my parents, she said quietly. I didn't respond right away. I kept scrubbing the frying pan in the sink, the water running over my hands. Finally, I glanced over my shoulder. And? They're furious, she said, her voice trembling. They think I've destroyed everything. They're not wrong, I replied, turning back to the dishes. Her voice cracked. John, I know I've made mistakes. Mistakes? I interrupted, spinning around to face her. You call 6 months of lying and sneaking around mistakes? You didn't just trip and fall into someone else's bed, Michelle. You made deliberate choices. Over and over again. She flinched, but I didn't care. I wasn't in the mood to coddle her feelings. I'm filing for divorce, I said bluntly. The papers are already in motion. Her face crumpled, and she covered her mouth with her hand. I thought we'd have more time to figure things out, she said. There's nothing to figure out, I said coldly. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. She stared at me for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. Finally, she nodded. I'll pack my things, she whispered. I watched as she turned and left the room, her footsteps echoing down the hall. The next morning, Michelle began moving out. She had arranged to stay with her sister, who lived a few towns over, until she could find a more permanent place. Emma and Ben were at school, which made the process easier. I didn't want them to see the boxes being carried out, to watch their mother leaving the house they grew up in. As I helped her load the last of her things into her car, I felt an unexpected pang of sadness. Not for her, but for the life we'd had, the life we'd lost. John, she said, standing by the driver's side door. I know you don't want to hear this, but I am sorry. For everything. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I hope someday you can forgive me, she added, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can, I said honestly. She gave me a sad smile, then climbed into her car and drove away. The house felt emptier after she left, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't the crushing loneliness I'd feared. Instead, it was a strange sort of calm. The absence of her presence, of the lies and the tension, was almost a relief. I sat Emma and Ben down that evening and explained everything as gently as I could. I told them that their mom and I were getting a divorce, but that it wasn't their fault and that we both loved them very much. Emma cried. Ben tried to act tough, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. I hugged them both, promising that we'd get through this together. Is Mom going to come back? Emma asked, her voice trembling. I hesitated. She'll visit, I said finally. But things are going to be different now. They nodded, clinging to me like I was the only thing holding them together. In that moment, I realized that they were my priority now. Not the anger, not the betrayal, just them. The weeks that followed were difficult. Michelle tried to call and visit as often as she could, but the dynamic had changed. The kids were distant with her, struggling to reconcile the mother they loved with the woman who had broken their father's heart. I threw myself into work and parenting, doing everything I could to keep life as normal as possible for Emma and Ben. There were moments of doubt, moments when I questioned whether I was handling things the right way, but I kept pushing forward. Eventually, the divorce was finalized. I got full custody of the kids, with Michelle granted visitation rights. She cried when the judge made the ruling, but I didn't waver. I'd fought for them, and I wasn't about to let them down. Now, months later, life looks different. The kids and I have found a new rhythm, a new normal. The wounds are still there, but they're healing, slowly but surely. As for Michelle, I hear from her occasionally. She's trying to rebuild her life, just like I am. I don't know if I'll ever forgive her fully, but I've stopped letting the anger consume me. I've learned something through all of this: life doesn't stop for betrayal. It doesn't stop for heartbreak. It keeps moving, and you have to move with it. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm moving in the right direction. What do you think about this story? Can betrayal be forgiven, or is it always the end of a relationship? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion matters and might support someone else. And don't forget to like the video if you like this story.